Philosophers have long debated whether the unity of a living organism can be explained by an intrinsic metaphysical principle or whether it must instead be grounded in causal, mechanistic processes. Aristotle famously anchors unity in a non-mechanical, indivisible form that organizes matter from within. But this view has drawn sharp criticism from thinkers who insist that life and organization must be explained through observable structures, interactions, and mechanisms. The following survey highlights several major philosophers who reject Aristotle's unity principle even more forcefully than modern science, each exposing the same fundamental weakness in his account: its inability to explain how unity breaks down, how it can degrade in stages, or how it can sometimes be restored. Dialectical parasitism names a pattern in argumentation where a claim gains its force not from its own independent premises, but by feeding on the commitments of an interlocutor. Instead of constructing a self-supporting structure, the parasitic argument latches onto what the other person already accepts and redirects that borrowed support toward a different, often incompatible, conclusion. It thrives by appropriating the host's inferential resources, definitions, principles, or intuitions, while contributing little of its own. This is why dialectical parasitism often appears in adversarial contexts. The parasitic move exploits the opponent's framework to undermine that very framework, or to smuggle in a conclusion that the opponent would never endorse on independent grounds. The argument's power is therefore relational rather than intrinsic. Remove the host's premises, and the parasitic structure collapses. Ontological parasitism, by contrast, concerns the dependence of certain entities or properties on more fundamental essences. Here the parasitic relation is not rhetorical but metaphysical. A hole depends on the cheese or the wall in which it appears. A shadow depends on the object that blocks the light. A smile depends on a face. These entities do not possess standalone being, they exist only as modifications, absences, or derivative features of something more primary. Classical metaphysics uses this notion to distinguish what belongs to a thing's essence from what merely clings to it. A parasitic property cannot exist without its host essence, and its identity is defined entirely by that dependence. In this sense, ontological parasitism maps the structure of being itself, showing how some phenomena are ontologically thin, borrowing their existence from the substances or processes that sustain them. Taken together, these two forms of parasitism illuminate different layers of dependence, one in the realm of reasoning, the other in the fabric of reality. Dialectical parasitism reveals how arguments can survive only by feeding on another's commitments, while ontological parasitism shows how certain entities survive only by inheriting their being from something more fundamental. Both expose a structural asymmetry. The parasite cannot stand alone, and its identity is inseparable from the host it relies on. Aristotle and modern science both talk about how organisms grow, but they do so with radically different explanatory architectures, which motivates bringing in the two parasitism concepts to make the contrast sharper, because each framework treats dependence and explanation in a different register. Aristotle: growth as expression of an internal principle. For Aristotle, an organism grows because it possesses an internal principle of motion, a soul, such, understood not as a ghostly substance but as the form, organization, and directedness of a living body. Growth is teleological. The organism moves toward its mature state because its essence pulls it in that direction. The acorn becomes an oak because oakness is already present as an organizing principle. In this metaphysics, growth is intrinsic. The cause is inside the organism. Development is predictable because the form determines the sequence. Hormones and growth factors, if Aristotle had known them, would be interpreted as instruments of the soul, material vehicles through which the form expresses its organizing power. Explanatory power comes from identifying the why, the final cause, the mature form, and the formal cause, the structure that guides development. This is a world where ontological parasitism is built into the metaphysics. The organism's parts, processes, and developmental stages depend on the essence as their host. A limb bud, a hormone pulse, or a growth spurt has no independent identity. Each is parasitic on the organism's form. Modern science: growth is mechanistic, causal, and predictive. Modern science strips away essences and focuses on observable, measurable processes. Growth is explained through, hormones, for example, IGF-1, thyroid hormones, growth factors, for example, FGF, BMP, VEGF, cell signaling pathways, gene regulatory networks, feedback loops, and homeostatic control systems. Here, predictability comes from statistical regularities and mechanistic models, not from teleology. The embryo develops into a human, not because of an essence, but because, DNA encodes regulatory programs, hormones modulate proliferation and differentiation, growth factors create gradients and positional information, feedback loops stabilize the system, environmental inputs constrain outcomes. Explanatory power is grounded in how processes unfold, not why they aim at a particular end. Dialectical parasitism between the two frameworks. When these two worldviews argue with each other, each can become parasitic on the other's premises. Aristotelians may say, your mechanistic account presupposes organization, directionality, and unity, Exactly what my notion of form explains. This argument feeds on science's need for system-level coherence. Modern science may say, your teleology is just a projection onto reliable causal sequences that we can already explain mechanistically. This argument feeds on Aristotle's admission that development is regular and predictable. Each side uses the other's commitments as a host to support its own conclusion. Ontological parasitism in the biological details. Modern biology actually contains its own version of ontological parasitism. Hormones depend on endocrine organs, growth factors depend on cell populations, gene expression depends on regulatory networks, developmental trajectories depend on environmental scaffolding, for example, maternal hormones, nutrients, oxygen. None of these processes exist as standalone entities. They are parasitic on the organism's integrated architecture. Aristotle would say, exactly, these processes only make sense as activities of a unified substance. Modern science would say, yes, but the unity is emergent, not essential. Aristotle's metaphysics shines when explaining why a living thing grows in a directed, unified way, but it struggles when asked to explain why that unity disappears and how it can sometimes be restored. Modern science, with its mechanistic and reductive tools, actually performs far better on this front. The contrast exposes a deep asymmetry in explanatory power, especially around causal structure, reversibility, and the boundary between life and non-life. Where Aristotle's unity principle breaks down. For Aristotle, a living organism has a soul understood as its organizing form, the principle that unifies its parts into a single functioning being. When the organism dies, Aristotle says the form is simply gone, the body loses its unity because the form no longer informs the matter. But this creates a problem. If the form is the cause of unity, and unity is lost, then the form must have departed or ceased to operate. Yet Aristotle cannot explain how or why the form ceases. He gives no mechanism for the breakdown of unity. Worse, he cannot explain cases where unity appears to be restored, because for him, once the form is gone, the organism is definitively not a living being. This leads to an ad hoc move. If unity returns, Aristotle must say the form never really left, because the form cannot re-enter matter from the outside. His metaphysics forbids reanimation, partial restoration, or graded recovery of unity. So Aristotle's framework fails to explain, reversible loss of function, suspended animation, resuscitation, cryopreservation, organ revival, cellular reprogramming, developmental arrest, and restart. All of these phenomena require a causal story about how unity can degrade and then be restored. Aristotle has no such story. Science succeeds because it tracks causal structure. Modern science, by contrast, treats unity not as an alanithing metaphysical principle, but as an emergent property of coordinated biological processes. Unity is maintained by, metabolic flux, membrane potentials, gene regulatory networks, hormonal signaling, growth factors, feedback loops, to syllable integration. When these processes collapse, unity collapses. When they are restored, unity returns. This gives modern science a decisive advantage. It can explain why unity is lost and how it can be regained. Examples, cardiac arrest. Unity collapses because electrical conduction stops, CPR and defibrillation restore it, hormonal failure. Growth halts because GHI-GF1 signaling collapses. Supplementation restores development, cryopreservation. Metabolic activity ceases. Warming and rehydration restore coordinated function, stem cell reprogramming. Differentiated cells lose unity of identity. Growth factors restore pluripotent organization. In each case, modern science identifies 1. The causal structure that maintains unity. 2. The causal breakdown that destroys unity. 3. The causal intervention that restores unity. Aristotle cannot do any of these because his metaphysics lacks mechanisms. Why this shows Aristotle's framework is causally thin. Aristotle's explanation of unity is elegant but static. It describes what unity is, not how unity behaves under stress, interruption, or restoration. His metaphysics assumes, the form is either present or absent, the form cannot degrade, the form cannot be restored, the form cannot be externally supported, the form cannot be partially active. But biology shows, unity can degrade gradually, unity can be externally supported. Ventilators, ECMO, hormones, unity can be partially active, unity can be restored after collapse, unity can be engineered. Synthetic embryos, organoids. Modern science therefore captures the graded, causal, reversible, and intervention-sensitive nature of biological unity. Aristotle's metaphysics cannot. The core insight. Aristotle gives a beautiful account of what it means for a living thing to be unified. Science gives a powerful account of how that unity is maintained, lost, and restored. When unity disappears and later returns, CO can trace the causal chain. Aristotle can only say the form never left, an ad hoc move that reveals the limits of his metaphysics. Several major philosophers reject Aristotle's idea of a non-mechanical, indivisible unity principle, even more sharply than modern science, because they believe that life, organization, and unity must be explained through causal structure rather than through an irreducible metaphysical form. Hobbes argues that all phenomena, including life, are nothing but matter in motion, So unity is simply coordinated functioning rather than a metaphysical principle. This allows him to explain both breakdown and restoration of unity in purely mechanical terms, something Aristotle cannot do. Descartes intensifies this critique by treating organisms as machines whose unity is mechanical and whose failures and repairs are likewise mechanical, making Aristotle's indivisible, non-mechanical unity principle look explanatorily inert. La Mettrie pushes the mechanistic view to its extreme, claiming that there is no soul or intrinsic principle of unity at all, and insisting that Aristotle's form is a fictional placeholder for ignorance of mechanisms. Hume rejects any appeal to hidden powers or substantial forms, arguing that we never observe a unity principle, only regularities in behavior, and that breakdown is simply a change in those regularities, not the departure of an essence. Darwin, without directly targeting Aristotle, undermines essences by showing that unity is a product of evolutionary history rather than an intrinsic form, and that breakdown results from failures in evolved mechanisms. Contemporary systems biologists go further by treating unity as emergent, fragile, and maintained by feedback loops, making it something that can degrade, partially collapse, or be restored, precisely the kinds of dynamics Aristotle's metaphysics cannot accommodate. Nietzsche rejects the entire framework of fixed essences, treating unity as a temporary dominance of forces and breakdown as a shift in power relations, thereby denying the very possibility of a stable unity principle. Taken together, these thinkers, especially La Mettrie, Hobbes, Descartes, Hume, Darwin, systems theorists, and Nietzsche, offer a far more radical rejection of Aristotle's unity principle than science alone, each insisting that only causal, mechanistic, or dynamic explanations can account for how unity arises, collapses, and can sometimes be restored. Taken together, these critiques reveal a broad philosophical consensus that Aristotle's metaphysical unity principle lacks the causal depth needed to explain the dynamic, fragile, and reversible nature of biological organization. Whether through mechanistic models, evolutionary history, emergent systems theory, or anti-essentialist metaphysics, each thinker replaces Aristotle's static form with a framework capable of accounting for breakdown, dysfunction, and repair. Their disagreements differ in style and motivation, but they converge on a single point. Unity must be explained by causal structure, not by an irreducible essence. This shared conclusion marks a decisive shift away from Aristotelian metaphysics and toward a more flexible, intervention-sensitive understanding of what it means for a living being to hold together and to fall apart.